Imagine a land where the sun rose over endless deserts, over palaces covered in gold and blood, where men believed themselves to be gods, and gods were invoked to justify any horror. That place existed, and it was called Persia. On ancient maps, it was remembered as the burning heart of civilization, the bridge between East and West, the crucible where science, poetry, and war mixed. But behind its greatness hid something deeper, an obsession with power, a religion of fear, an entire society built on the idea that purity could be born from corruption. Greek chroniclers called it the nation of the most beautiful and cruelest men. And they were right, because in Persia, the sacred and the impure coexisted in the same temple. Kings crowned themselves as envoys of Ahura Mazda, the god of light, but ruled with the most absolute darkness. Every gesture of piety hid a crime. Every ritual of purity concealed a stain that no one dared to name. The Persian Empire was born of fire. In the year 550 BC, Cyrus the Great conquered entire kingdoms with a vision that mixed devotion and tyranny. Under his command, Persia stretched from the Mediterranean to India. But dominating territories was not enough. Souls had to be dominated as well. And to achieve this, Zoroastrian priests created a system that turned obedience into a virtue and dissent into a sin. Thus, the king's law was not just political, it was divine. To question it was to defy the gods. In the marble cities, the walls were engraved with scenes of sacrifices and offerings, while the fields to the north burned with the bodies of the condemned. Caravans carried silk and spices, but also rumors of terror. No one escaped the control of the king's eyes. His gaze was a sentence, his silence, a judgment. In such a vast empire, fear was the only language everyone understood. However, the most chilling thing was how that fear had become a custom. Violence was not hidden, it was celebrated. Death was not a tragedy, it was a tool of cosmic balance. The Persians believed that every cruel act served to maintain the harmony of the universe, as if the suffering of one were the inevitable price for the peace of millions. It was a theology of pain, and no one could escape it. Inside the fire temples, priests preached that the purity of the soul must be reflected in the purity of the blood. A dangerous idea, because it soon became law. To preserve the divine lineage, kings began to marry their sisters. Incest became a virtue, and heresy a forbidden love. On the surface, it was about preserving royalty. In reality, it was an attempt to defy nature itself. Thus was born one of Persia's darkest traditions, the union between siblings, a practice the people observed with reverence, without understanding the genetic and spiritual price it would entail. And while the altars burned with incense and chants, the shadows of the palace whispered names of deformed children, of maddened princes, of queens consumed by guilt. But faith was stronger than reason. No one dared to doubt, because to doubt was blasphemy, and blasphemy was paid for with one's life. Persia was not just an empire of warriors. It was a laboratory of the human soul, where light and darkness mixed until they became indistinguishable. There, beauty and cruelty were two faces of the same God. The people worshipped the perfection of order, without noticing that this order was sustained by human bones. In the upcoming chapters of this story, you will discover a world where love was a duty, justice, torture, and devotion, condemnation, where bodies were instruments of power, and power, a form of faith. Prepare to delve into ancient Persia, the place where horror wore silk tunics and crowns of gold. In the heart of the Persian Empire, the palace walls echoed with chants speaking of purity and devotion. But hidden among those sacred notes was an unthinkable truth. Love was forbidden, and only duty to the bloodline was worthy of the gods. Persian kings believed their lineage came directly from divine will. To preserve this supposed perfection, they married their own sisters, convinced that by doing so, they kept their family's celestial essence intact. What was an abomination to the rest of the world was an act of faith to them. Cambyses II, son of the legendary Cyrus the Great, was the most devout in this belief. His marriage to two of his sisters was not a secret, but a spectacle. Zoroastrian priests blessed that union with prayers and sacred fire, while the nobles applauded in ecstasy. The streets of Persepolis were filled with incense, gold, and perfumes, as if heaven had descended to earth. But behind the hymns, a more sinister echo was hidden. Every kiss between siblings was a declaration of power, a denial of humanity. The Persians called this rite Kswedoda, the union with one's own. According to them, mixing the same blood strengthened the bond with Ahura Mazda, the god of light. But later historians would see it as a pact with darkness. The biological consequences of that practice were inevitable. Deformities, mental illnesses, entire generations marked by genetic degeneration. Yet no one dared to stop it. Tradition was law, and the law was divine. The fear of corrupting the sacred blood created an elite closed in on itself, a lineage of kings who distrusted anything that was not a reflection of their own face. In the marble chambers, portraits of their ancestors multiplied like distorted mirrors, reminding them of their duty to preserve purity at any cost. And so marriages became sacrificial ceremonies disguised as love. Princesses were born already betrothed, not out of love or political convenience, but by an imposed destiny. Their childhood was measured in days of confinement, preparing for the moment when their older brother would claim their hand. The priest taught them that to resist was to offend the gods. At 13 or 14, they were presented in colossal weddings where luxury served to hide the tragedy. Thousands of flowers, endless banquets, blinding jewels, but not a single smile was sincere. Behind the veil, every bride's gaze was empty. The kings, drunk on power, confused devotion with possession. They believed they were the guardians of a celestial purity, when in reality they were condemning their own lineage. In the oldest tales, it is said that some children were born with different colored eyes, pale skin, and soulless voices. The priests called them children of the test, convinced that the gods sent them to measure the royal family's faith. None of them survived for long, and yet this practice was not limited to the throne. The Persian nobility imitated it with fervor. In an attempt to get closer to the divine, feudal lords married their daughters to their sons, their sisters to their younger brothers. They did it in secret at first, then with pride. Consanguinity became a symbol of power, a mark of prestige. The more closed the bloodline, the closer they believed they were to the gods' favor. But the reality was different. Diseases spread silently among noble families, and palaces began to fill with sick, weak, or mentally unstable heirs. The empire stood tall, but its biological foundation was slowly rotting from within. The most chilling part was the religious justification. Priests claimed that the gods punished with deformity only those who had impure hearts. Thus, every monstrosity was interpreted as a test of faith, not as a genetic warning. Imagine being a princess of that era. Your destiny was already decided before you were born. You knew neither love nor freedom, only the obligation to surrender your body and blood to the lineage that had created you. At night while the palace slept, perhaps you looked at the stars and wondered if the gods were really watching you, or if they had left centuries ago, leaving men alone with their own shadows. Alexander the Great's chroniclers would later write that when the Greeks conquered Persia, they were horrified to discover these rituals. But what amazed them most was not the act itself, but the calmness with which the Persians defended it. To them, the unthinkable was not a sin, it was simply custom. And so, generation after generation, Persia maintained its throne upon a mountain of secrets and deformities. An entire society convinced itself that love had to be purified in blood, even if it meant destroying it. Because in the empire where purity was God, humanity was the true sin. Behind the walls of the Persian palaces hid a second empire, that of the harem, a labyrinth of marble, perfumes, and invisible knives. It was not the king who ruled there, but the women who shared his bed in his condemnation. Every wife, every concubine, every slave was a piece on a chessboard of power, as silent as it was deadly. From the gardens of the palace of Susa to the endless corridors of Persepolis, the air was thick with jealousy, prayers, and secrets. And at the center of that golden world stood an unquestionable truth. Only she who gave the king a male heir could live without fear. The Persians considered the harem a symbol of greatness. A king could have hundreds of wives, each with her own entourage, her own perfume, her own corner of the palace. The harem of Xerxes I, chroniclers say, housed more than 300 women. No two were alike. Some came from distant conquered tribes. Others were daughters of local nobles given as political offerings. But they all shared the same destiny, to compete for the gaze of a single man. Life inside the harem was a nameless war. Smiles were masks, embraces, strategies. Every word, every gesture could seal a woman's life or death. Stories speak of poisons hidden in ointments, of wine cups that never reached the king's lips, of servants disappearing in the night. The most powerful wives surrounded themselves with spies and loyal slaves, fearing being poisoned by a younger rival. Within those walls covered in silk and gold, death had a sweet scent, perfumed with musk. Princes born of the harem grew up amidst luxury and paranoia. Each knew that his half-brothers could become mortal enemies. In that environment, childhood was a minefield. Some chroniclers recount how mothers poisoned the children of other wives to secure the future of their own. Children's laughter mixed with muffled cries and desperate prayers. The king, for his part, rarely intervened. Letting the women fight among themselves was a way to maintain the balance of fear. Only the most cunning, the most ruthless, survived to adulthood. Persian harems functioned as microcosms of the empire. Luxury on the surface, terror at the roots. Each wife represented a conquered province, each son a promise of continuity. But behind that structure hid something even more cruel, the total dehumanization of women. They were not people, but titles, ornaments, instruments of male power. Their value depended on their womb. Their voice was forbidden. Under the laws of the empire, a wife had no rights whatsoever. She could be beaten, sold, or executed without trial. Imagine a young wife, barely 16 years old, who has been chosen from among hundreds. Her hands tremble as servants cover her in jewels and perfumed oils. She knows that tonight will decide her fate. If the king looks at her, she will live among silk and fear. If he ignores her, she will be forgotten forever, turned into a shadow within the walls. Beauty was a curse, and indifference a sentence. There were, however, women who learned to survive in that labyrinth. Some became secret advisors, voices whispering ideas into the monarch's ear. Others used manipulation and charm to secure a place of power. But most were living ghosts, bodies locked in gold, souls trapped in silence. The harem walls heard more confessions than the temples, more prayers than the priests. Every night the echoes of female prayers rose toward the vaulted ceilings, seeking a god who did not answer. Modern historians often portray the harem as a symbol of Oriental luxury, but in reality it was a prison wrapped in silk. The women there were not free even in death. When a wife died, her body was treated as the king's property. She was buried without a name, without a prayer, covered in cloths so as not to contaminate the royal air. Only those who had provided an heir received dignified funerals. That system of confinement and obedience molded the mind of the empire. Men learned to dominate, women to remain silent. Violence was inherited, just like blood. And in that endless cycle, Persia perfected a form of control based on the deepest fear, the fear of being forgotten. Because in the harem, being forgotten was worse than dying. That obsession with purity, beauty, and obedience would create the roots of a culture where male power became absolute, where love was a tool of domination and compassion a weakness. In the Persian Empire, even feelings had to obey the king's law. In the next part, you will see how that same logic, that of power disguised as justice, extended beyond the palace walls. Because if women were prisoners of the king's desire, his subjects were prisoners of his justice. And in Persia, justice was synonymous with torture. Persian justice knew no mercy. In an empire where the king was considered a living god, the law did not serve to protect the people, but to remind them of their insignificance. Every decree, every sentence, carried the weight of fear. And if love in Persia was a form of obedience, justice was a form of divine punishment. The Persians did not believe in forgiveness. To them, a crime was not just an offense against the state, but a spiritual stain against the order of the universe. Thus was born a system where torture became a spectacle. Punishments were not carried out in secret. They were public, ceremonial, carefully designed to be etched into the collective memory. In the squares of Ecbatana or Persepolis, the condemned did not simply die, they were transformed into living warnings. One of the most feared methods was scaphism, known as the boats. The victim was stripped naked and placed between two wooden canoes with their head, hands, and feet exposed. The executioners fed them milk and honey until it caused diarrhea. Then they smeared their face and limbs with more honey, attracting swarms of insects under the blazing sun. In a matter of hours, the body was covered in flies, wasps, and larvae. For days, maggots fed on the living flesh, while the condemned still breathed. It was a slow death, turned into religious theater, the punishment for traitors to the king's divinity. But scaphism was only the beginning. Impalement was the favorite tool of imperial judges. A sharpened stake, carefully greased, was inserted through the condemned's rectum and made to exit through the shoulder or throat. It was then planted vertically in the ground, letting the body's weight slowly push it downward. Some agonized for 3 whole days, while priests recited prayers about the purification of the soul. Every scream was interpreted as a confession. There were punishments for all levels of sin. A thief lost his hands, a liar was whipped into delirium, an adulterer was stoned in front of the entire community. But the most terrifying aspect was the arbitrariness. In Persia, you didn't need to be guilty to die. A wrong look was enough. Looking at the king without permission was an insult to the gods. Speaking before he ordered it meant immediate decapitation. No one was safe, not even the princes. There are chronicles that tell how Darius's own son was executed for arriving late to a ceremony. Another prince was whipped to death for contradicting his father in public. Terror did not distinguish blood or rank. It was the universal language of power. The entire court lived in a choreography of submission, measured steps, bowed heads, visible hands, held breaths. Even a sneeze could be interpreted as defiance. That culture of absolute fear was not just political, but theological. Zoroastrian priests taught that pain purified the soul, that the suffering of one maintained the cosmic balance between light and darkness. Thus they justified every torment. Divine justice did not need compassion, because compassion was considered a human weakness. In the Persian view, order had to be maintained with fire and iron. Punishments became rituals. The families of the condemned were required to attend and watch. Some fainted, others screamed prayers begging for forgiveness. But no one could look away. Witnessing the punishment was part of the citizens' moral education. It was a pedagogy of horror. He who saw, obeyed. Imagine walking down a street in Babylon under Persian rule and hearing the drums announcing an execution. The people gathered as if for a festival, with children on their fathers' shoulders. As the sun set, blood gleamed under the glare of the torches, and when the executioner raised his sword, the silence became absolute. No one cried, no one screamed. Only the dry sound of flesh being cut and the wind carrying the ash could be heard. That was the lesson. In Persia, life did not belong to men, but to the king. And the king was the incarnation of the gods. His word was the border between existence and nothingness. Thus, peace was maintained, not out of respect, but out of terror. For centuries, that strategy worked. The Persian Empire was a model of stability, not through justice, but through fear. Rebellions were almost non-existent. Citizens preferred silence to the grave. Obedience became an instinct, and fear, a religion. But a system based on pain could not last forever. Every whip, every unjust death, every child forced to watch their father's execution sowed a seed of resentment, and those seeds would grow over time until they blossomed into the fall of the empire. Because no god, not even the gods of Persia, can sustain a throne built on eternal suffering. If justice in Persia was written in blood, education was forged with blows. From the earliest age, children were molded to serve the empire. There was no room for innocence or play. Childhood was not a right, it was a test. Because in the Persian worldview, the body and soul had to be tamed before learning to obey. At 5 years old, the sons of nobles were torn from their mother's arms and sent to training camps in the mountains. There began the process that would turn them into immortals, the most feared soldiers of the empire. They slept on the freezing ground, drank murky water, hunted their own food, or starved to death. Compassion was punished, crying forbidden. If a child cried, he was beaten in front of the others. If he showed weakness, he was left to starve until he learned to suffer in silence. The instructors, war veterans hardened by campaigns, did not teach with words, but with punishments. Beatings, fasting, sleep deprivation. The children grew up learning that pain was a friend and pity, a betrayal. Every scar was a medal. Every suppressed tear, a victory. At 15, the few who survived were returned to the court, transformed into soulless warriors. Greek chroniclers spoke of them with terror. They called them athanatoi, the immortals. It was said there were 10,000 of them, but in reality, every time one died, another immediately replaced him, always maintaining the same number. They marched in silence, wearing bronze armor that shone like fire under the sun. Their discipline was unbreakable, their faith absolute. They did not fight for gold or glory. They fought for the fear instilled in them since childhood. Imagine a night in one of those camps. A child shivers in the freezing wind, his knees bleeding. He hears the roars of wolves in the distance and the crunch of ice beneath his body. He does not dare to sleep because he knows that if he closes his eyes, his instructor will wake him with a whip. He clenches his teeth, breathes slowly, and repeats the words he was taught. Pain is the truth. Weakness is a lie. That phrase, which was supposed to give him strength, slowly turned him to stone. The Persians believed that fear was a form of wisdom, that only he who had known suffering could serve the king without hesitation. That is why education did not seek knowledge, but obedience. The goal was to destroy the will. The young nobles returned to the palace turned into shadows, into killing machines. In imperial ceremonies, they were shown as examples of virtue. They did not smile, they did not speak, they did not breathe without permission. Meanwhile, noble girls lived their own hell. From the age of 8, they were instructed not to think, but to serve. They were taught how to move, how to smile, how to sit, how to lower their gaze before a man. They practiced every gesture, every word for hours. They were repeatedly told that their value depended on their purity, their silence, their obedience. A good wife does not ask, she obeys, the teachers told them, and every mistake, every distraction was paid for with blows. The fate of these girls was sealed before their first menstruation. Some were betrothed to nobles, others were sent to the harem. None could choose. Their lives were contracts between families. Disobedience was not an option. Even in intimacy, their bodies did not belong to them. A man could beat, sell, or kill his wife without facing any punishment. Before the law, she did not exist. She was property. But the cruelest part was that the system itself taught them to accept this slavery as an honor. Mothers repeated to their daughters the same words that were once said to them. To serve the husband is to serve the gods. Thus, generation after generation, fear and submission were inherited like a sacred tradition. In the farthest provinces of the empire, peasants imitated these customs with blind devotion. The villages were full of starving children with hard stares and women aged before they were 30. Pain had become the national language. No one wondered why. No one imagined another way to live. Sometimes among the mountains, veteran soldiers remembered their years of training and felt an emptiness they did not know how to name. They had survived hunger and the whip, but they did not know what to do with freedom. Compassion seemed like a foreign luxury to them. In days of peace, many asked to return to war because only in chaos did they know who they were. That was how Persia formed not just an army, but a mentality, that of the heartless warrior, of the voiceless subject. Education became a factory of obedience, a mold that crushed any spark of humanity. And while men learned to kill and women to remain silent, the priests said that everything was fine, that the order of the world depended on that discipline. But beneath that perfect order, something was beginning to break. Because no empire, no matter how powerful, can survive when it teaches its children to fear more than to love. As the years passed, the cycle of pain in Persia became part of the very breath of the empire. Every child grew up knowing that their worth depended on their usefulness, and every woman understood that her life did not belong to her. And between those two worlds, that of the warriors and that of the wives, stretched an invisible wall made of silence. In the golden palaces, a woman's fate was decided long before her heart learned to love. Noble girls were given away as promises from birth. Their lineage was a currency that men used to seal alliances or demonstrate power. Some were betrothed to their cousins or even their own brothers in a perpetual echo of consanguineous practices. They had no choice, and even desire was not a right. Your duty is to honor the blood, the priest would tell them, and that phrase was enough to chain them. Imagine a young princess, the daughter of a powerful nobleman. Her name will be forgotten, like that of so many others. She lives secluded in a chamber filled with tapestries and oil lamps, where the air smells of jasmine and resignation. She knows that she will soon marry her brother, a man she barely knows. She has seen him only a few times, always surrounded by soldiers and advisors. But she has already been told that their union is divine will, that her body will purify the family's blood. That night, as the wind batters the curtains, she kneels before the sacred fire and prays, not for salvation, but to learn how not to feel. Marriage was not a bond of love, but a contract of obedience. A woman belonged first to her father, then to her husband. She had no legal rights, no inheritance, no voice. If she made a mistake, if she raised her eyes when she shouldn't, if she failed to bear a male heir, she could be repudiated or punished without trial. Persian law allowed it. The punishment could be a public beating or simply being abandoned in a remote part of the desert. In the fire temples, the priests reinforced this order with words wrapped in faith. They said that female obedience maintained the balance of the world, that every tear shed in silence strengthened the gods. Religion became both the refuge and the prison of women. If they suffered, it was because the gods were testing them. If they died, it was because they had failed in their faith. The wives of the nobles lived an existence of marble and shadows. On the surface, they had everything: jewelry, servants, perfumed gardens. But they could not leave. They could not speak without permission. They could not look at the world that existed beyond their walls. Some slowly went mad, talking to the birds that perched on the windows or to their own reflections in the bronze mirrors. Others accepted silence as a way of life, turning submission into their only means of survival. There were, however, women who learned to use their intelligence as a shield. Through cunning, the control of rumors, and subtle manipulation, they managed to influence their husbands' decisions. They could not speak in public, but they spoke through their sons. They could not rule, but they ruled in the shadows. Their power was silent, almost invisible, but deadly. In the Persian annals, there are mentions of mothers of the throne who decided wars and alliances without ever leaving their chambers. But for every one of those women who achieved power, there were hundreds who disappeared into the darkness. In the official records, there are no names, only numbers: wives, concubines, servants, daughters. History does not remember them because power did not consider them human. They were merely the others, the ones who ensured the lineage continued. The punishments for disobedience were ruthless. A woman caught in adultery was stoned to death. A wife who questioned her husband's authority could be sold as a slave. And if she dared to flee, she was hunted down, captured, and hung in front of her own home as a warning. A man's honor was more valuable than any woman's life. Meanwhile, the priests spoke of purity and virtue, justifying the cruelty with sacred words. They said that a woman was the mirror of a man's soul, and that if she became stained, he had to cleanse her with fire. Thus, punishment became a ritual. Female tears fed the altar of power. Even so, amidst so much pain, some resisted in silence. A slave who hid a fleeing wife, a mother who secretly taught her daughter to read, a concubine who, before being executed, spat on the temple floor and muttered, "The gods do not look at me, but I see them." These small rebellions were invisible to history, but they formed an underground current that slowly eroded the pillars of the empire. Because no system can sustain itself forever, when half of its people live on their knees and in silence, the echo of those drowned voices still resonates in the deserts of Persia. If you close your eyes, you can hear them in the evening wind. Broken promises, unanswered prayers, dreams of freedom. Nameless women, but with souls of fire, who waited for a dawn that never came. And while the wives and concubines died in their silk cages, the Persians were preparing an even darker ritual, one that began just as life ended. When life ended in Persia, the terror did not. Death was only the beginning of another obedience, Obedience to the ritual. No body could rest underground. No soul could cross the threshold without the priest's permission. Because for the Persians, the elements, earth, fire, water, were sacred. To bury a corpse or cremate, it was to desecrate creation. Thus was born one of the most disturbing customs of antiquity, the towers of silence. High in the mountains, far from the cities, circular stone structures were erected. The dead were brought there naked, covered only by the dust of the road and the fear of the living. They were placed on platforms open to the sky, where scavenging birds waited like messengers from the beyond. The vultures descended first, then the crows. In a matter of hours, the body was devoured. The bones, bleached by the sun, were collected days later and thrown into a central pit. This act, considered sacred, was mandatory for everyone. The family had to attend the ritual, watching in silence as the birds tore the flesh from their loved one. No one was allowed to cry. Tears were interpreted as a sign of doubt before the gods. The priests recited prayers while the metallic smell of flesh filled the air. And when the first vulture spread its wings, everyone knelt. It meant the soul had been accepted. But if the birds did not approach, if they circled in the air without touching the body, the horror began. It was said that the soul was cursed, that it had offended the gods. The entire family fell into disgrace. They were expelled from the temples, forbidden to trade, condemned to ruin. Some houses disappeared forever because the vultures rejected a corpse. The religion of fire and purity then became an invisible tribunal. The most perverse aspect was how this system fed the power of the priests. It was they who interpreted the signs, who decided if a soul was pure or impure. And they were also the ones who offered special rituals to ensure divine acceptance. Rituals that cost fortunes. They promised to attract the vultures with perfumes, with mantras, with offerings. Desperate families handed over their wealth for a promise they could never verify. The temples filled with gold while the villages fell into poverty. Thus, even in death, fear continued to rule. You did not fear hell or eternal punishment. You feared that the vultures would not come, that your soul would remain trapped in limbo, forgotten by the gods and despised by men. It was a perfect form of control. Not even the most powerful could escape the judgment of heaven, because that judgment was dictated by the priests. Imagine a gray morning at one of those towers. The wind cuts the skin. A group of men ascends the path, carrying a body wrapped in linen. The family walks behind without speaking. At the top, the priest waits for them with a lit torch. He prays in a low voice as the body is placed on the stone. The silence is absolute. Suddenly a call shatters the air. A vulture spirals down, followed by others. Black feathers cover the flesh. The crowd sighs, the priest smiles. The soul has been forgiven. In that moment, religious power feels tangible. The gods seem present. But what truly dominates the scene is not faith, but fear. Fear of being next, fear of not being devoured, fear of being forgotten. Death in Persia was a mirror of power, silent, ritualistic, controlled. Some Greek philosophers who traveled through the empire wrote about these towers with horror. They said that the Persian people had confused purity with the denial of life, that their ceremonies were not tributes to the dead, but a way to punish the living. And perhaps they were right, because in a society where even corpses obey, freedom ceases to exist. Zoroastrian priests used this fear as a political tool for centuries. They promised salvation in exchange for gold. They threatened those who questioned the rituals with misfortune. The towers multiplied, the offerings increased. Persia became a civilization where the living worked to ensure an acceptable death. And the most ironic thing of all was that, beneath the glare of the sun, the birds that devoured the dead were also feeding on the empire itself. Every body offered was a small victory of fear over hope, a collective confession of submission. Over time, the Towers of Silence became a symbol of Persian power. From afar, their silhouettes looked like guardians of the horizon, but in reality, they were monuments to human fragility. They reminded everyone that neither gold, nor nobility, nor devotion could save you from being reduced to white bones under the sun. And while the vultures carried out their task in the heights, in the palaces, the king faced his own obsession with purity. Because if the dead had to be clean, the monarch's body had to be perfect, untouchable, divine. and that obsession would take madness to an even more absolute level. In the palaces of Persepolis, purity was not a virtue, it was a religion. The king was not a man, he was the living reflection of the gods. His body had to remain uncontaminated, his breath had to smell of incense. His skin could not be touched by common hands. No one, not even the doctors, was allowed to approach him directly. When he fell ill, the priests observed his symptoms from a distance, reciting prayers so as not to sully his holiness. If the king coughed, the court trembled. If he bled, it was interpreted as a cosmic bad omen. The water he bathed in had to come from sacred springs, sometimes located hundreds of miles from the palace. Entire caravans set out across the desert, carrying sealed gold vessels. If a single one broke, if the seal cracked, the entire cargo was destroyed, and the journey had to begin again. The king could wait weeks without bathing, but he would never use impure water. Every drop had to be worthy of contact with his divine skin. The royal cooks lived in total isolation. From the moment they were chosen, they were confined within the palace kitchens, with no possibility of seeing the outside world. They spent years, decades, preparing food that they themselves would never taste. Their families could only visit them twice a year, under surveillance. The ingredients were inspected by 30 guardians of purity. A single suspicious grain of wheat could condemn the entire batch. Thousands of pounds of food were destroyed as a precaution. Meanwhile, in the villages, the people were starving to death. The court, however, continued to throw bread and wine into the deserts to purify the excesses. It was an obscene contrast. While the peasants buried their children, the king ordered food to be burned for fear of contamination. And the priests applauded him, saying that the monarch's purity ensured the stability of the world. That obsession with the clean and the sacred extended to every corner of the empire. The nobles imitated the king's rituals. They washed their hands with milk, wore white tunics, and avoided touching the servants. The temples were filled with incense, but the real smell was that of fear, because purity was not cleanliness of the body, but control of the soul. Everything had to be kept in order, unmixed without error. Impurity was tantamount to rebellion. In the palace hallways, the servants walked in silence, with their hands crossed over their chests so as not to touch anything by accident. If one of them tripped or broke a sacred object, they could be executed instantly. Even the animals that belonged to the king were treated as extensions of his divinity. The horses slept on carpets, the dogs were fed lamb meat. But if an animal showed signs of illness, it was sacrificed immediately, not out of mercy, but to prevent the impurity from reaching the court. The entire system lived under the logic of perfection, a perfection so rigid that it began to crumble from within. Because absolute purity, when imposed by force, becomes a disease. Foreign doctors who traveled to the Persian court reported scenes of mass hysteria. Courtiers who bathed 10 times a day, priests who purified the air with fire, queens who refused to touch the ground with bare feet. The fear of the impure had replaced faith. Psychologically, the king became a prisoner of his own cult. He could not eat without suspicion. He could not sleep without guards watching his breath. He could not trust even his own children. He lived surrounded by luxury and loneliness, worshipped by millions, but touched by no one. He was the most powerful man in the world, and at the same time the most isolated. This isolation of power created a caste completely disconnected from reality. The nobles moved in a parallel universe, convinced that their blood made them immortal, that their bodies were purer than those of the common people. They did not see the misery, the disease, or the hunger growing on the margins of the empire, and when they did see it, they considered it a necessary offering. That moral indifference was the beginning of the end. Because while the priests counted the coins from their rituals, and the nobles bathed in milk, the Macedonian legions were already marching eastward. Purity had weakened the empire more than any enemy. The obsession with remaining incorruptible had corroded it from within. The myth of the God King was beginning to crack. His body, untouchable, would soon be dust. His palace, his sanctuary of marble and gold, would become a ruin, because no divinity survives when it forgets that it was born of flesh. In the next part, history will show its inevitable conclusion, the collapse of an empire that confused fear with faith and purity with power. The Persian Empire had built its power on pillars of golden silence, but every structure, no matter how sacred it may seem, collapses when its foundation is made of fear. In the year 330 BC, the roar of Macedonian hooves crossed the eastern borders. Alexander the Great, young and bold, marched at the head of an army that did not fear the Persian gods. He carried with him something more dangerous than spears, the certainty that men could kill gods. When the Greek troops reached the gates of Persepolis, the air smelled of smoke and decay. The sacred gardens were abandoned, the fountains dry, the servants famished. The priests fled with chests of gold. The nobles locked themselves in their marble chambers, praying to deities that no longer answered. Purity had failed. The gods of fire and blood remained silent before the arrival of a force that did not recognize them. Alexander did not just conquer the territory, he stripped bare the empire's lie. He found a subjugated people, a corrupt court, a royal lineage degenerated by centuries of incest. The perfect bodies of royalty were deformed. The divine heirs were sickly individuals who could not hold a sword. The most powerful empire of the ancient world crumbled without resistance. The young conqueror, horrified and fascinated at the same time, ordered the destruction of Persepolis. Flames devoured the palaces that for centuries had been a symbol of purity and power. The frescoes of the gods cracked under the heat. The columns melted like wax. The harems were emptied, the priests were executed, and the towers of silence were left abandoned, with no bodies to feed them. The vultures, deprived of their feast, flew off into the desert. But the fall of Persia was not only military, it was spiritual. The faith that had held the empire together dissolved like sand through fingers. Without fear, men began to think. Without the priests, families discovered that they could bury their dead with dignity. And without the god-king, the people understood that the gods did not live in palaces, but in the mountains, in the wind, in their own hearts. The splendor of the past transformed into ruin. However, the legacy of Persia survived, not as glory, but as a warning. Later empires, Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, would learn from the Persian model. They would copy its art, its politics, and also its terror, because the idea of ruling through fear is contagious. And in some corner of history, there is always someone who believes that pain can sustain order. Persian torture methods were repeated for centuries. Scaphism was studied by Roman executioners. Impalement became a symbol of divine punishment in the Balkans. Even the notion of pure blood resurfaced time and again, disguised as nobility, race, or ideology. The obsession with purity, which destroyed Persia, continued to travel the world under other names. Today, archaeologists walk among the ruins of Persepolis. The stones engraved with the faces of kings still look to the horizon with empty pride. Under the sun, the marble seems to shine, but if one listens closely, one can hear the echoes of laments, the muffled prayers, the footsteps of the women who never left the palace. Every block of stone is a petrified memory of the horror and beauty that coexisted there. Because Persia was a perfect mirror of the human condition, capable of creating poetry and slavery, temples and torments, sublime art and moral abysses, a civilization that confused greatness with perfection and purity with death. The fire that consumed Persepolis did not just destroy an empire, it illuminated a truth that continues to burn in history. No civilization is invincible when it feeds on suffering. Absolute power does not need enemies to fall, it devours itself. Perhaps that is why, when the wind blows through the ruins, the stones seem to whisper an eternal warning. No throne is safe from pride. No faith survives without compassion. And so, as the ashes of the past blend with the desert sand, Persia leaves us its final lesson. That civilization and barbarism are not opposites, but shadows that walk together under the same sunlight.